Welcome to Season 2 of Classical Education, a podcast for those who believe in rediscovering the art of asking questions, engaging in conversation, and attending to the ideas at the heart of well-ordered teaching and learning. Adrian Fries and Trey Bailey invite you to join them on a journey in pursuit of the true, the good, and the beautiful as we participate in the great conversation and listen to the many voices coming from the world of classical education. Today is our final episode for Season 2. Trey and I hope you enjoy this very special and magical conversation about Tolkien and the spirit of Christmas. But before I introduce our special guests, I have noticed a lot of questions and great conversations on our Facebook group. There are many people asking about what books to read and how to teach classically. And it seems that many of you may not be aware that we have courses that support everything you hear on this podcast. I currently serve as a pedagogy and curriculum specialist for a classical school, but I also homeschooled my children for 15 years, so I'm very passionate about reaching not only classroom teachers, but homeschoolers. I have carefully chosen a team of excellent trainers to help you experience how to teach classically and why to teach classically. These are the $1,000,000 questions. So I have several immersion courses if you want to experience how to be a classical teacher, and I have several book seminars on why to teach classically. If you're interested in exploring the why of classical education, all of us at Beautiful Teaching are experienced educators and students of classical education, not only in the classroom, but as homeschoolers. Many of you may not be aware, but Trey was homeschooled and I homeschooled my children. So we're a great team. We have experience in all areas of different courses and different expertise. So I've got lots of consultants on there ready to teach classes to you. We also have made them very affordable for homeschoolers and teachers. So visit our website with our courses called coursestorm.beautifulteaching.com. Again, coursestorm.beautifulteaching.com, and you'll see immersion courses, book seminars, and also some classes that are great for parents if you have kids at a classical school. Be great to read some of these books. So we have divided those into those categories for you, and we hope to see you there. If you have any questions, you can always email me at beautifulteaching@gmail.com. That's beautifulteaching@gmail.com. Thanks for listening and have a Merry Christmas. We are so excited about this episode. So it's a great treat. Happy holidays. Today, Trey and I have two amazing guests, Richard Rohlin and Reno Lauro. And we invited them on the show because they are both what we would consider experts or lovers of Tolkien. And we wanted to offer a Christmas episode on kind of a theme of Tolkien and fatherhood and Christmas and whatever other avenues Richard and Reno want to take the discussion. I realized in thinking about how to introduce them that we could do an entire episode just on introducing Richard and Reno and their work in the realm of Tolkien. And so I don't even know where to begin with all of the work they do in the world of Tolkien, the magical world. But they both have voices and thoughts that are very important for this discussion. And I know Richard has several podcasts, which I think I'm going to have you, Richard, tell a little bit about, your Tolkien world. And then also Reno, you share a little bit about your Tolkien world because you both have so many irons in the fire on this that I would do it injustice to even explain how much work you guys have been doing in this realm. So Richard, you can introduce yourself in that world, and then Reno.
Sure, yeah. So the big thing that I do Tolkien related, if you want to just like go out and find what are my thoughts about Tolkien, is that I am the co-host of the Amun Sul podcast, which is on Ancient Faith Radio, and it is AMON space SUL. If that's for you to remember, you can just simply go to tolkienpodcast.com and it'll redirect you to the appropriate link. And so I'm the co-host of that along with my friend Father Andrew Stephen Damick, and we talk about the writings of J.R.R. Tolkien specifically from an Orthodox Christian perspective, but we have a lot of guests on who are Christian, but maybe not necessarily Orthodox, but they have thoughtful, useful, interesting things to say about Tolkien. So that's the big thing I do. Those episodes are usually pretty long, usually an hour and a half, 2 hours, something like that. So you can hear my thoughts ad nauseum. The other things that I do, I've done a fair amount of writing and publishing about Tolkien over the years in various essay collections, anthologies, things like that. Most notably, I should have had a copy of it here to sort of show to the camera, but I have a chapter in a book called "Amid Weeping There Is Joy," which was published by my friend Dr. Cyril Jenkins, who you should have on this podcast if you have not done so already.
Mhm.
But he put this anthology together of sort of Orthodox Christian readings and Eastern Christian readings on of the legendarium. So I have a chapter in there actually about rood screens and Tolkien and the Pearl poem. So people, if you want to check that out, you can buy that book on Amazon. It's called, again, it's Amid Weeping There Is Joy. And then if you just go to YouTube and put my name in, you will see that I am all over YouTube in many different places. The main thing that I've been doing is a monthly series. We had to take a little break in the fall because of travel, but I've been doing a monthly series with Jonathan Pajot on the idea of medieval universal history. So we talk about how medieval people sort of, let's say, wrote themselves into the Christian story as they converted. In fact, we just recorded a really cool episode about that yesterday, and that'll be going live soon. And then we've got another recording set this month to do specifically about the Beowulf poem, right in time for Christmas, because of course, as everyone knows, Christmas Eve is the time to tell ghost stories and monster stories. It's not Halloween; it's Christmas Eve, and this is Christmas Eve, and Beowulf. I mean, you couldn't ask for a better monster story. So that'll be coming out soon, and then maybe some other cool announcements about some things we'll be collaborating on soon. So, and then I've got fantasy writing and publishing. This book came out earlier this year. This is the Akborida, which is like a weird sort of foray into world building, but you could say like liturgical world building would be how I would describe it. So if you like fantasy literature and like this, this is a Tolkien podcast. So if you like fantasy literature and specifically like the Silmarillion, then this will be something you might be interested in. And that's available from Darkly Bright Press. You can just go to darklybrightpress.com, and we'll have another book coming out sometime next year. So stay tuned for announcements about that. So anyway, that's
Okay,
basically
and
it.
we'll definitely put all the links to everything that both
Yeah,
of you
yeah,
guys are talking about in our show notes.
yeah. Great. Yeah.
Okay,
So
Reno.
that's it.
That's that's fantastic. Hey, so I actually came to Orthodoxy and Orthodox Christianity and Christianity, like I feel like through Tolkien. I did a PhD on Tolkien's philosophy of Mythopoeia and hyperreality at the University of St. Andrews, and published some chapters, encyclopedia entries, had a blog for a long time called Time Out of Joint. Um, and I quickly, after I finished my PhD, found classical education, as many people on this podcast know, and have been able to incorporate my work with Tolkien into classical education. I like to call myself the 27th most foremost Tolkien scholar in the world, because I recently discovered that some essays that I had written on Tolkien actually have created a lot of traction. And I suddenly found myself having kind of introduced some novelty in Tolkien scholarship. And so recently I have been managing the Tolkien's House of Being Facebook page and irregularly updated Substack, and am working on a book with Kent State University Press by the same title, Tolkien's House of Being. kind of expanding some of the work that I've done with Tolkien. Between that, I also spent some time working in the film industry. I spent the better part of 2 years working for uh, Terrence Malick on the Palme d'Or winning film, The Tree of Life, which I like to. There's lots of Tolkien stories when it comes to Malick with fatherhood and with Tolkien and cinema. But the big thing about that experience was really working with somebody who uh, uh, understands kind of the mythopoeic, but working with it in a different medium. And it completely transformed my understanding of Tolkien. One, working with someone famous, working with an artist, for an artist, I should say. I merely kind of painted a corner of a cloak or something in his great painting. But so that's been my experience with Tolkien. I have a short little chapbook on Tolkien and Anglo-Saxon Christianity coming out with Darkly Bright Press next year, hopefully in the autumn, if there isn't a paper shortage and the economy doesn't collapse. So.
Thank you. This is so exciting to have both of you on the show. And hey, Reno, since you brought up the word mythopoeic, and I'm sure a lot of our listeners are wondering, what is that? Some of them know what it is, but could you give us a brief explanation of that before we move into our deeper topic of Christmas and fatherhood?
Yeah, absolutely. Um, eh, Tolkien famously wrote a poem in 1931 called Mythopoeia, which really is it's a capsule that captures his anthropology of myth, storytelling, uh, and faith. Uh, it happened after a famous conversation on Addison's Walk with C.S. Lewis, which was a instrumental moment in C.S. Lewis's own life in kind of coming back to a belief in God and Christianity. Uh, and essentially, Mythopoeia it takes the idea that God is a storyteller and creates us as storytellers. It's who we are as human beings. Uh, to take the great cosmological story of the great storytelling architect and to continue to reveal creation and reveal that story through myth and our own stories. And it's really important because it really is before someone like Joseph Campbell and the Hero with a Thousand Faces became popular. Tolkien really understood that that myth and the beauty that we see in folk myth and then folk tales as they kind of move through history reveal something true about what it means to be a human being and God's design for us.
Hmm. Thank you. Trey, do you want to open up with a question?
Yes, I'd be happy to. So, in preparation for this conversation, we have been considering some of the letters that Tolkien wrote to his children in the guise of Father Christmas, or maybe let's say in the spirit of Father Christmas, or perhaps we could even say as Father Christmas. And so I do hope that over the course of this conversation, we will get to talk about Father Christmas, or as we know him, Santa Claus, in great detail. And I think that will not only be great fun, but also really a key to understanding Tolkien as a father. Because whereas he's well known in the world at large for the books that he's written, he applied his imagination and his ability to craft stories and to draw and to just really capture the hearts and minds of children in his own home with these letters that he wrote for many, many years. So I wonder, Reno, if perhaps you could set the scene for us by just telling us a little bit about Tolkien's home, tell us a bit about his children, and perhaps that'll be a good way for us to start a conversation about his letter writing as Father Christmas.
Yeah. Tolkien is very frank in many of his letters. he married his sweetheart, the love of his life. They were both essentially orphaned, and he really fought through through age and faith differences, and guardian the advice of guardianship to be able to be with her. We should also mention World War One as well. So they had four children, three boys and one daughter, Michael, John, or John, Michael, and Christopher and Priscilla. Um, and by all accounts, I mean, Tolkien was always, he notoriously was late in publishing anything. I really resonate with Tolkien as a scholar, father, husband. Uh, he was notoriously late in getting things to the publisher. I think one Chaucer, Oxford Don, said that Tolkien is ridiculous and has set back Chaucer scholarship by 20 years because he hasn't gotten a particular Chaucer manuscript in, right? Uh, um, but it's because fighting through financial difficulty and grading extra papers and doing extra exam work and external examination work that he was with his family as much, I think, as was possible. We don't have a really great account of the as far as I know. Richard can probably have some other juicy details, but the real kind of inner workings of family life, like was he a hugger? Was he a kisser? Was he a tucker inner at night? Right. We've got a little bit of kind of historical distance, but we do know through his letters, specifically Father Christmas letters and his letters to his children, or at least his three boys. There's, I think, maybe two letters collected that have been published to Priscilla. That he was incredibly attentive and involved in their formation.
Well, I've so enjoyed looking through these Christmas letters in particular, and one of the things that I delighted in was the very fact that he went to great lengths to ensure that his children believed in Father Christmas. I mean, I think I even read somewhere that he would even dust the letters with snow, or ensure that he, made a postmark from the North Pole. And so this reminds me of something that I did when my wife and I lived in Alaska several years ago. We actually happened to live just down the street from North Pole, Alaska, that has a Santa Claus house where you can go and visit Santa there and send and receive letters and whatnot. And so we got the idea that we would, like Tolkien, write Santa Claus letters to children, and we open it up to friends and family, and we're able to mail it from the Santa Claus house there in near Fairbanks, Alaska. And of course, this delighted the children, and just really was a wonderful experience for me to allow Father Christmas or Santa Claus to act through me in writing these letters. And I want to consider the details of these letters further, and I'll let you jump in here, Richard. But perhaps this would be a good place to start with the question that a lot of families wrestle with today in our modern world, which is how does Santa Claus fit into the Christian home? And I just find it noteworthy that Tolkien not only wanted his children to believe in Father Christmas, but that he would go so far as to write these letters and to really establish a relationship, a line of communication between his children and Father Christmas. So, Richard, maybe you could pick us up there.
Yeah. So I'll begin with a personal anecdote, if that's all right. When I was very young, I was told growing up, and this is a curious thing. I mean, for people who don't know, I grew up in a very sort of strict fundamentalist Baptist home, and not, which was great. Like, just to be totally clear, I had a great childhood, so I'm not complaining about that. But I grew up in this very strict fundamentalist Baptist home, and one of the things that was kind of part of that was um, uh, there really was not a sense that there was a real Santa Claus. Or rather, let me put it this way. What I was told growing up is that, well, Santa Claus was a historical person named Nicholas of Myra. We wouldn't have said Saint Nicholas, but he's a historical person named Nicholas of Myra, and he was a pastor in the early church, and he was persecuted for his belief in Christ by the Roman Empire, and all this stuff perfectly true. And then he died in the late 4th century. So this is what I was told growing up about Santa. And so when I was probably 4 or 5 years old, my aunt took me. I was we were in out in East Texas, which is where my family's from. This is not my real accent. My real accent actually sounds like this. But anyway, so we're out in East Texas, and which is where my family's from. And my aunt took me to the mall to go see Santa Claus, right? And she thought this will be a fun thing to do with my nephew. Jokes on her. So we got there, and I looked at the man sitting in the big chair, and I said, "Well, he's not Santa Claus." And she said, no, he's Santa. She's trying to like preserve the illusion, not knowing what a pedant she had on her hands. And I said, well, he's not Santa Claus, because Santa Claus is dead. This is what I had sort of taken away from all of that, is there was a Santa Claus and he's dead now. So I said, that's not Santa Claus, he's dead. No, that's Santa. And apparently, I don't actually remember this super well, but apparently I got increasingly upset, and I started to shout, Santa Claus is dead, dead, dead. And it upset all of the other children in the line for obvious reasons, and my aunt was asked to leave. So that was my sort of, yeah. So that's my early engagement with the whole, you could say, Santa Claus mythos. So despite all of this, I grew up a sort of a great lover of Christmas, and Christmas was and remains a big deal in my family. And my dad would get the Santa outfit, and we would know it was time to open presents on Christmas morning, because there would be sleigh bells jingling downstairs, and a hearty ho 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 that my dad would do. So we went through all of the motions, you could say, but we were told we were told it was kind of an act. But I mean, this is the thing, man. Christmas is so magical, that even if you try to disenchant it, you can't really help yourself. Like, it just sort of runs away with you. And so, despite the fact that my parents, tried to deliberately disenchant the holiday, which they would have said was just trying to tell you like the truth, trying to tell us the truth about the world, um, uh, they couldn't help themselves, in terms of participating and kind of getting caught up in the spirit and things like this.
Mm-hmm.
And if you want to, I think it was Joshua Gibbs who said, if you want an argument for why Christ really was born on December the 25th, which is something that I believe, and I will fight anybody, who wants to convince me otherwise. But if you want a real argument, it's something, for that, like something really special does happen on Christmas Day. It's the only time that the vast majority of Christians in North America will put up a statue of Mary in their homes.
Oh,
Right?
sure.
I mean, think about that.
Yeah.
My all of my Baptist family members, they're putting up nativity sets in their homes. There is there's a sense of peace and goodwill that kind of pervades and overcomes the things that normally divide us around Christmas. And even like the whole Santa thing, like, again, you can say I don't believe in it, but it's very hard to, I mean, you'd have to be a real, and I use this term literally, you'd have to be a real Scrooge to kind of not do the Santa thing with your kids. And so then, it comes down to the question, well, what should I tell my children, and what's real, what's not? What if they think that, like, what if they become, violently hurt and upset later on in life when they find out Santa isn't real, and all these questions. So you've got Tolkien here, and he starts out doing and this is to me, this is like just a beautiful window into Tolkien's creative process. He starts out doing something that's sort of for fun, and so he starts out, it's just like, here's like a little letter, a little postcard, probably because his son wrote to Santa. And so he's like, wouldn't it be fun if Santa wrote back? So he just does like this little postcard and includes like a little illustration on the postcard and has it mailed back. And that starts a thing. Well, now the kiddos are expecting things. And of course, as we know, Tolkien's children, especially Christopher, were very attentive to, things like continuity errors in Tolkien's writing and stuff like this. And so year after year, the letters have to get more elaborate. And so 1925, if you're reading through the Father Christmas letters, 1925 is the year when the lore really starts to come into things, and we meet the great polar bear. And then later on, we find out the great polar bear has a name, and we find out there are snow elves. And the man in the moon, who is actually if you wanted to make a Tolkien cinematic universe and like connect all of his unconnected writings, the Man in the Moon is the connective tissue because he appears in The Lord of the Rings in a song. He's also one of the most important characters in Roverandom, which is set in our world. He also shows up in the Father Christmas letters and so on. Man in the Moon is basically all over the place. Tolkien just really liked this story. He liked to, use it and reuse it. And what typically happens in all of the Man in the Moon stories is he comes down, stays out too late, gets drunk, passes out, doesn't get back to the moon in time, and bad things start happening on the moon, and then he wakes up and he has to run up and fix everything. Anyway, and then of course the wonderful thing is that he keeps this going as he has more and more children born. And so, for instance, in the 1927 letter, I have to say, I feel a deep kinship with Tolkien here, because he starts it out saying, "My dear people, there seem to get more and more of you every year. I have 5 children now, so I feel this in my soul." And then he says, "I get poorer and poorer." And so, I mean, this is the thing, the Tolkien was never shy in his letters and his personal life. He was never shy about addressing the really hard realities of actually living life, married life. I mean, the Tolkien household was not perfect, and we sort of do Tolkien and ourselves a disservice if we try to paint it as this. Yeah, he married his sweetheart, but their marriage was difficult at times, right? They remained religiously divided for the rest of their lives. Although she did officially convert to Roman Catholicism, she stopped attending church with Tolkien after a few years of marriage, and remained, personally pious, but didn't go to church with him. And there were some other difficulties. Um, their oldest son was sexually abused by a friend of the family, and this probably went on for some time. And this is back when people didn't talk about these things, right? And so it wasn't, it was never really dealt with. And so I'm just saying all this to say, family life was difficult, right? Tolkien raised a family through 2 world wars. Right. He raised a family through poverty, through hunger, through rationing, through air raids, through all of these different things, and then watched his sons go off to fight a war after he'd done that himself at that same age. Really difficult times. And if you look, especially at his letters back and forth to Christopher, when Christopher is fighting in the Second World War, he's in the RAF. I think he's in Africa. They're just full of this really kind, lovely paternal concern. And same with his letters to his son Michael. So anyway, all of this to say, where do the Father Christmas letters fit into all of this? The Father Christmas letters are they're a beautiful kind of nexus of all of these things. And I would say one of the main things to take away from them is that Tolkien's primary audience was always his family, and it was always his children. Even The Lord of the Rings really is written to Christopher and for Christopher, right? But his primary audience was always his children, and you can see just the gears turning in his mind simile, a metaphor he probably would have hated. But you can see things sort of clicking into place, because as he writes, the lore gets more and more developed, and by the end of the Father Christmas letters, like there's a war with the goblins, there are elaborate elven alphabets, like he just can't help himself. This is what he does. And yeah, so that doesn't totally address the question of maybe how to um how we deal with Saint Nicholas in our own families or whatever. And I don't know if you
Right.
want to talk about that some, but I think that for Tolkien, to do this right, to it's this is just a natural outgrowth of who he was as a father, right? This is what he did. This is one of the main ways that he showed love to his children, was to tell stories for them, to build worlds for them, to feed their imaginations. And he did this through a very difficult life, and a very difficult time in world history. And for Tolkien, this is how you keep the lights on. This is
Right.
how, I mean, gosh, like you need Christmas, you need
Hmm.
Father Christmas, you
Yeah.
need Saint Nicholas, you need these stories, because if you don't have this stuff, then the pain of the world is going to just overwhelm you.
Hmm. Well, I would like to center at least this part of our conversation about Father Christmas and how he fits or does not fit into the Christian home today. And I think we have Tolkien as a beautiful example to look to. All of the various things you mentioned, I think, are very relevant to the conversation. I've been doing some reading about the life of C.S. Lewis, and of course, there's a temptation to think that any of these men that have a reputation for writing beautiful stories and for being great defenders of truth had perfect lives, and of course that's just not the case. They had families just like all of us have families, and families are complicated and made up of human beings who sin against each other and against themselves, and so the same is true with these men. Um, Specific to the conversation about Santa Claus, I do find it rather noteworthy that, as we've been discussing, Tolkien really went very intentional in crafting this relationship between Father Christmas and his children. C.S. Lewis included Father Christmas in Narnia as a gift giver, and so there's that. And then G.K. Chesterton, of course, was from a different time, but is oftentimes included in this panoply of great thinkers and people that we would like to look to for advice. He, in Chesterton's own fashion and style, went to the newspaper in defense of his belief in Santa Claus, and very rigorously defended um, uh, both the tradition and the practices, but also the existence of the man. And so, perhaps we could talk in more detail about that. And I'm just curious, Reno, do you believe in Santa Claus?
Yes, absolutely. 100%. And I think this is the kind of missed point. It can be a missed point in Tolkien's letters to Father Christmas, right? Um, if we don't believe in Santa Claus, if we don't believe in elves and in werewolves and in vampires, then especially in the context of classical education, we're merely approaching it ironically, right? We're really modern people, sophisticated moderns who like to dabble as though we go to the Renaissance fair with playing and enjoying the affects of a more primitive age, right? One of my favorite letters from Tolkien to Christopher it's letter 68. And he's writing to Christopher. It's 1944, and he says, "Very much love to you, and all my thoughts and prayers. How much I wish to know when you return to the lands of the living, and we retell our tales, sitting by the wall in the sun, laughing at old grief. You shall tell me later then." Faramir to Frodo, he says, in parentheses, right? So, and here, I mean, Christopher understands this context, but more than that, right? Understanding that these tales have teeth in reality and make sense of the tales that we live. With the letters to Father Christmas, I mean, the incredible detail that Tolkien gives is more about connecting Father Christmas in a modern age, in an age of flying Nazguls, in an age of the machine and cybernetics. That Father Christmas is a tale that comes to us from a more ancient and more true time. What's interesting is that he doesn't connect Father Christmas to Saint Nicholas. When he gives the age of Father Nicholas, he says, I'm 1927 years old, which is astounding, right? Because what he's doing is connecting it to the birth of Christ itself. And there's this both and in the letters of Father Christmas, right? That this story both is and is greater than what we really realize about him.
That's a kind of a father. That's a kind of a Ghost of Christmas Present reference too, right?
Yeah.
The Ghost of Christmas Present does the same thing in A Christmas Carol, right? Where you sort of realize like he's the embodiment of Christmas.
Mm.
Yeah.
Now we should note. I mean, you mentioned C.S. Lewis. Tolkien notoriously hated both the Chronicles, the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and the reference to Father Christmas in Narnia, right? Hooper documents this, and Lancelin Green as well documents this. And Tolkien incredibly disliked bringing together a northern myth, which he saw as Father Christmas, with fauns. Like these stories don't have, they're not together. And what that would do, as Richard pointed out, with the children kind of caring about consistency, is that it destroys the reality of the story. It destroys its rootedness. So when you say, do you believe in Santa Claus? The answer is absolutely yes, in the same way that I tell my boys that werewolves are real, right? When they're playing out front, I'm like, you can't be outside the gates of the castle because werewolves are out there. Oh, Dad, werewolves aren't real. They absolutely are real. But nobody is alive to say or to be able to testify to the moment that they see it transform because they've been devoured and destroyed, right?
Yeah, we had a great conversation with your wife related to monsters when we did our Frankenstein and Dracula episode. And so I think we could definitely take the conversation that direction. I want to articulate some thoughts I have about Santa Claus, and I would love for both of you to help me think through this and help me perhaps nest this and maybe reattach it to to tradition and to the things that need to be conserved and preserved, because as you all well know, this is the time of year when the Santa Claus wars start up again, and you have people who take up their corners and make very rigorous and detailed arguments as to why Santa Claus should or should not be a part of the life of the Christian family, and questions of his origins and questions of his role in terms of how he's connected to Christmas, and just all of this is sort of stirred up again.
And I will say to that, just by the way, like this is something I think is very much worth arguing about. And even if somebody comes to a different conclusion, I appreciate that there are people who feel like, hey, Santa Claus is important enough that we should have an argument about this.
That's right.
Sometimes people will look back at like church history or something and say like, oh, look at all these people arguing over all this complicated language about God. Why couldn't they just be unified? I'm like, no, you don't understand. They were unified. They were unified on the fact that they thought this was important enough to argue about. And just because we don't doesn't mean it's not important. So if people feel like hey, Santa is important enough to let's have an argument about it, I'm there. Let's do it.
I couldn't agree with you more, and I think it was Chesterton who reminded us that this is the season of forgiveness, and so even if people don't believe in Santa Claus, we should forgive them.
Sure, yeah.
And so just as much as Santa Claus is worthy of conversation and argument, well, like semantics, right? Like try to say it's just semantics to one of the Inklings and see what they would say. So let's get into this a bit. I think Richard, you can probably help us quite a bit in attaching our understanding of Santa Claus to pagan traditions and pagan
Sure, yeah.
culture, because this is something that comes up a lot, and there's the accusation that, well, Christmas is really just a pagan holiday, and I would be in agreement with Chesterton again that insofar as there is truth to the claim that Christmas is a pagan festival, that really only goes to show that the ancient pagans were much more sensible than us modern ones. So I wonder if you could maybe help lay out the argument there in terms of sort of what are some of the things that the people will say, Christians will say,
Yes, of
against the
course.
practice of Santa Claus, saying, well, that's just some remnant of some pagan belief.
So we can start with the sort of larger claim, maybe, that Christmas is a pagan holiday. So this is based on a few different things. Ultimately, most of the stuff goes back to a book written by a Scottish Presbyterian named Alexander Hislop. It's called I think it's called The Two Babylons or Mystery Babylon, something like that. Hold on, I'm gonna look it up because it's got a really metal sounding title.
Yeah. It is The Two Babylons.
The Two Babylons, but the subtitle.
Yeah, the
subtitle's really really salty. Here, hold on. It's gosh darn it. Here we go. It's The Two Babylons, originally subtitled Romanism and Its Origins. Also subtitled Or Papal Worship Proved to be the Worship of Nimrod and His Wife, with 61 woodcut illustrations from Nineveh, Babylon, Egypt, Pompeii, and etc. So it has a couple of subtitles. So you can sort of like, yeah. So most of this Christian holidays are pagan stuff comes from this source. The book is a hoot to read. It is also total bunk. It's not historically accurate or verifiable or respected or anything like that today, but it's the source of like a lot of these objections. So the argument typically goes something like, Christmas is an adaptation of either a Germanic pagan holiday, of Yule, or the Roman pagan holiday of Saturnalia, and that Christmas was just chosen. They decided, well, we'll put the birth of Christ on this day so that we have a festival, so that people will stop doing Saturnalia and they'll do Christmas instead. First of all, they say that like that's a bad argument. I'm so baffled by the idea that would be an argument against celebrating Christmas. But anyway, and then they'll point to a variety of Christmas traditions, such as Christmas trees, and they'll say, oh, well, this is actually a pagan practice, bringing a tree into your home, or what else? Santa Claus is actually, they'll say Santa Claus is actually, or Father Christmas, this is actually a reference to like Odin, and the Wild Hunt, right? And these different things. And so they'll point at these different things and say, this stuff it's a holdover from paganism. So there are a few different responses to this. And I mentioned before we started the recording that I am a veteran, a scarred veteran of the Christmas Wars. I was a evangelical pastor for about 8 years before we became Eastern Orthodox, and we had to deal with this every year because there was a discussion pretty much every year: is it okay for us to decorate the church for Christmas, or even hold a service on Christmas Day? And there were a lot of people who, in our church, a minority, but a significant minority, who felt like we should not, because of this, these concerns, and they would send around the same video every year, and so we had to have this discussion. So I started like just sort of every December, I would start the December by preaching my obligatory apologia for Santa Claus, to sort of like, get out in front of this stuff and sort of say, listen, I'm not telling you you have to go home and celebrate Christmas in your home, but this is why we're doing it here at the church, and things like that. So there are a few different responses that can be made to this. The first is simply to say that Christ won, right? Christ has defeated the old gods. So this is why we can read Homer and not be worried. This is why we can, you could say about the old gods, they made terrible masters, but they've made adequate servants. And so we don't. First of all, we don't have to be afraid as Christians. Like anybody listening to this, I'm giving you permission. You don't have to be like afraid of paganism lurking behind rocks and trees, and it's gonna jump out at you and whatever. Like again, a lot of these associations are historically have been historically debunked, right? The connection of Christmas trees to Germanic paganism, for instance, is non-existent, can't be proven. And if you actually look at why Christmas trees started becoming a really big deal, they've been done since the Middle Ages. This goes back to the fact that in the Middle Ages in the West, one of the main themes of Christmas Day was actually the story of Adam and Eve and the expulsion from paradise. And this sounds weird, like why would you talk about that on Christmas? I have an answer to that question, but it would take me another hour to talk about. So, but I'm actually going to give a talk on it for our catechesis and adult Sunday school class tomorrow at St. Seraphim. So, that's not going to help people watching this video, but anyway. So there's a so the idea of the evergreen tree, so that it is of course the tree of life. It's the tree that doesn't turn colors during the winter, right? So it's always young. It's evergreen, literally. So you bring it into the home and you decorate it, and it's the tree of life, and it's part of this. Well, Luther was a big proponent of the practice of the Christmas tree, and it was specifically because he wanted to get people to stop erecting nativity sets in their homes, right? To not put up the statues, not put up the creches. And Lutheranism wasn't like super iconoclastic, but it was definitely more iconoclastic than I think sometimes people remember. And so he was trying to get people to stop doing the creche. And so he said, well, let's do Christmas trees instead. And what happened? Everybody was like, you know what? Christmas trees are great. Also, creches. Creches are great. And people just did both. And this is the thing about Christmas. Of all the holidays of the Christian year, it's not as important to our faith as Easter, for instance. But of all the holidays of the Christian faith, Christmas is the stickiest. And so because of this, like you can't really, like once you introduce a new Christmas tradition, you can't get rid of it again. And so you can't get people to stop putting up nativity sets. They'll just put up a Christmas tree too.
Yeah, there you go. Well, it has this way of developing, and another word we could use, we could say it's sticky. It's also absorbent,
right?
And
yes.
so, in as much as Christmas has absorbed pagan customs,
right?
It absorbed them because they were humane, and because they belonged to Christ to begin with, right? Like they
so
go ahead.
Yeah. So this is the thing: is that you could say symbolically, when else would Christ have been born? When else should the light come into the world?
Right.
Except at the darkest time of the year. And this is the thing: people assume that, oh, well, if it works symbolically, then that can't be real because real things don't click together that nicely. Right. But then, like, I mean, by that logic, you'd have to do away with like all the Old Testament prophecies of Christ and things like this. Like when else? I mean, Christ is the maker of creation. He's the master of the cosmos. He's the one that made the times and the seasons. Like, when else would he come into the world? And the thing is, every culture knows you've got to have a big festival in the middle of winter. Right? Why do they know that? Because they know there is something significant about the fact that we need to preserve the light and keep the light sort of hidden and safe during this darkest time of the year. But why would that have why would that then invalidate the fact that this is when Christ comes into the world? And in fact, if you look at when does the celebration of Christmas start to really take off in the Christian world, it's
Mm-hmm.
during the Arian controversy. Specifically during the 4th century. It's celebrated before then, but it's during the Arian controversy, because at this particular time there was a specific version of Arianism that said that Christ really didn't become divine until he was baptized. This is actually Apollinarianism, but in any case, but it's an offshoot, right? It's this idea that that Christ didn't, like, he was just born as a human, and then at his baptism, basically the mind of God entered him, so he was like had a human body, but then like a divine mind or soul. And there are actually, there are people who still teach this today. There's a really prominent Reformed apologist who actually teaches this. But so in order to combat this, one of the things that the church did, St. Gregory the theologian, St. Gregory of Nazianzus, was one of the main people who put this forward. To really combat this, the church started really making the celebration of Christmas more significant, because what Christmas is an affirmation of is that the child born of Mary and laid in the manger is already God worthy of worship.
Yes. But before we get into that, I feel like we should let Reno jump into the conversation.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'll just kind of add and continue the conversation, right? And we'll tie it back to Tolkien saying that the age of Father Christmas is 1927 years old, or going back to the birth of Christ, right? That the God of dung and straw is the God of men and elves, right? That the nativity is the epicenter of enchantment. That's what Tolkien is essentially saying. Uh, there's a wonderful, so Tolkien obviously has a translation of the Green Knight, and Richard was talking about, the Green Knight should be read in all homes during Nativity. But he has a beautiful essay, 1953, after Tolkien became a professor of, principally a professor of Middle English, right? So he started off as Old Norse, then Anglo-Saxon, and then of Middle English. So this is 53. I think it's the Merton professor, Richard. I'm not, but he has a beautiful essay, 1953, actually recommended to me by Terrence Malick. He was like, "Have you ever read Tolkien's essay on the Green Knight? It's really beautiful." And in this essay, Tolkien talks about something more ancient behind this story of the Green Knight that even the author of the Green Knight maybe wasn't completely aware of, right? But this story of fairy and revolving around Christmas lets us know that the material world is, there's more to the material world than just the dung and straw. That there's something greater behind it, surrounding it, and infusing it. And this is the connection with the letters of Father Christmas, is that in an age when motor cars are prevalent, and there's phonographs and radio, and bombers flying over, and tanks and mustard gas in the battlefield, that uh, um, the traditions that we have inherited somehow need to maintain their connection to a more ancient and true sensibility, a way of interacting with world and things that reveal to us what it means to be a human being. And so this goes back to the Mythopoeia and the Mythopoeic, right? That we have, it is paramount, especially in an age of robots, that Christmas, we see Christmas as not just a holiday or something merely magical, but it's a mythopoeic season. So.
I'm so glad, Reno, that you brought up the material world, because one of the things that people will accuse Christmas of being, and will lump Santa Claus in all of this, because he brings us material things, um, is that Christmas is just materialistic, and I'm just not really persuaded by that argument, because I don't think we're nearly as materialistic as we've been accused of being. In fact, I don't think we care about matter nearly enough.
We're
I think if
definitely
anything,
more Gnostic than
oh, I think
materialistic.
that's so true. Yes,
Yeah, yeah.
Gnosticism is run rampant, and this divide between the spiritual and the material is this is that we've really created a well, we've just, as you pointed out, fallen back into Gnosticism, and this is what is oftentimes preached in pulpits pertaining to Christmas, is sort of railing against materialism, when I don't know a single child who goes to bed sort of dreaming about how, the fact that Santa Claus is bringing him gifts is going to be so good for the economy, right? I mean, like, that's just not something that children are terribly concerned with. But what they are compelled by, and what I think should be nurtured in the home, is the fact that some spirit of um, generosity cares for them and gives them things with no sort of desire for anything in return, other than sort of passing on love and kindness and gift giving, right? The spirit of gift giving. Um, and my children still to this day, and they're very young, so that they haven't sort of had this sort of taught out of them by well-meaning teachers and social workers and whatnot. But uh, they are very grateful to Santa Claus. They still look at the things they have and are thankful and grateful in that way. And so that, I think, is very much a part of the spirit of Christmas. And I think Santa Claus embodies the spirit of Christmas in a very unique way. And whereas Tolkien doesn't, in that instance, tie Santa Claus back to the Saint Nicholas, I think he's actually doing something much more subtle there by tying him back to Christ, who, of course, all saints have died to themselves, and it is not the saint who acts, but Christ through them, right? And so this is where I'm going to put forward my argument, and I'd love to hear what both of you think about this. And I have to credit Jonathan Pagel for helping me put some words to this, something I've been thinking about for several years now. And I think it's a responsibility for all fathers to think about when it pertains to Santa Claus and how they invite him into their home. So let's see how do I want to say this? I, with Chesterton and with Tolkien and I suppose C.S. Lewis and hopefully others of great company, believe in Santa Claus. And I believe in Santa Claus because I believe in saints, and I believe that saints are dead but alive, right? Right. So you were right as a little boy. Yeah, Santa died, but guess what? When you die, you resurrect and you live again. And one day, the bodily form of Santa Claus will be resurrected, and we'll all live in a new heaven and new earth.
But even now, his relics continue to stream myrrh and work
that's right.
miracles.
That's true.
And I was in Miami 2 weeks ago, and speaking at a parish there, Christ the Savior Cathedral in Miami, and Father Joseph took me into the nave of the church there, and right up front there's a piece of Saint Nicholas. There's a piece of his bones right there in the middle of the church. And yeah, so I mean, yes, looking forward to the resurrection, but also, like, we have these tokens, like you could say, like down payments on the resurrection of the dead, which is kind of what relics are.
Yeah, I think that's quite right. Reno, you had a comment on that?
Yeah, I was going to connect this just kind of back to Mythopoeia and Tolkien as a father, and like what our responsibility is, right?
Please.
That there is the kind of the priestly responsibility,
yes,
with our children, but there is the rich tradition of folk tales and stories and myths that allow us to kind of see the world itself as to see the implications of the nativity. to see the
Right.
implications of the incarnation, to see the implications that we worship of God, of spirit and of dung and straw.
Yeah.
That uh, um, that that when we go into forests, it is a forest plus. These tales are not merely. I think Arthur Machen makes a distinction between what is real and actual. In my teaching and in our home with the boys, when I'm told magic isn't real, or somebody's that right now my sons are being challenged with whether or not other kids are trying to tell them that Santa Claus isn't real.
Right.
It's like real as being the operative determiner of 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 reality. It is the misnomer. It's like, I'm not sure about that, but what I am concerned about is what is true, right? And everything about magic and everything about Father Christmas, everything about elves in the forest and werewolves on dark paths,
Yeah.
is absolutely completely true and 1,000% not only consistent with nativity and the incarnation, but there is a necessary relationship between them.
Yeah.
And I think that's what Tolkien's telling us with his children and with these stories, is that it is paramount in the age that we live in to preserve this so that our children can engage the world as an enchanted space.
So here's what I've thought of thus far. It seems to me that Santa Claus absolutely exists. I think that's an undeniable fact. Now, the question of how he exists would take further conversation.
Right.
But the question of does he exist, I think, is a silly question, because obviously not only does he exist in stories and in song, but there's icons of him everywhere. And then you can actually go like Richard did and sit on his lap in the mall, right? Now, the question is when you're sitting on Santa's lap there, who are you talking to? And this is something that Jonathan Pageau gets into and probably will say it much better than I'm about to. But, the child is not talking to Joe when he's telling this man what he wants for Christmas. He's talking to Santa Claus. And if Joe sitting there acting in persona Santa, if you'll excuse that phrase, I think that's an appropriate phrase.
It is 100% acceptable.
Perfect.
The whole basis of Christianity is that one person can do something on behalf of somebody else.
Yeah.
And it counts.
Absolutely.
And if that's not true, you can't be saved.
That's I mean, you really took us home right there. We need to circle back around to that.
I've been quiet, but Richard, I want you to expand on that, because I think that was super profound.
I mean,
I agree with you.
Yeah.
Can we hold off on it, because
finish what you're saying, Trey, and I'll come back around to that.
Because I think that's the home run that we're all aiming at here.
Yeah.
Okay, so the child is talking to Santa Claus, and if Joe acts as Joe and starts telling the kid about his recent divorce and how he's having a hard time making his car payments, the kid knows he's not talking to Santa Claus.
Sure, yeah.
Right? And so there is the embodiment of Santa Claus in that place. And then in the home, I'm going to make the case that in order for Father Christmas to be invited into your home, it's going to take Christian fathers and Christian mothers. And listen, Father Christmas will act through non-Christians as well, right? And that's sort of the crazy thing about Christmas. Not only is it super absorbent, but it's worked its way into almost every nook and cranny. And it takes some real Scrooges, as you say, to sort of try to drive it out, but it almost always finds its way back in again.
Yeah.
And so in the home, you've got the folks who, are going to make this argument that, well, you're lying to your children, and, they need to be really clear on, the material cause of exactly how those, presents are getting under the tree or in the stocking. And of course, I would want to agree with them, saying that, of course, and as far as the material cause is concerned, yes, I'm going to have to talk quietly here. I am, my wife and I, right, take the gifts and we buy them, right? Anymore, we order them on Amazon. forgive us. And we put them out there, right? Now, here's the thing. Would I do that by myself? No. What do I want to do after my children are in bed? Well, if I'm telling the truth, I want a strong drink and probably watch some YouTube videos and read a book. That's what I want to do. That's what Trey wants to do. What does Santa Claus want to do? He wants to put gifts out. That's what he wants to do. And so I willingly allow Santa Claus or Saint Nicholas to act through me, right, as the material cause to make these things happen. And if I choose not to do that, then I've chosen not to invite him into my home. And we all wake up to a whole lot of coal in the fireplace, and that's it. And so anyhow, I'm just not all that compelled by the folks who want to sort of cut us off from that tradition of believing that, number one, saints are alive and intercede on our behalf, but also like are still working in the world. And what is the agency by which they sort of have hands and feet in the world? Well, that's us. And frankly, I mean, that's exactly what we say about Christ working in the world, right? Like that he works through his church, and that's how he is sort of physically made present in the lives of people. And so I think in the same way, it's a really beautiful thing to embody saint, this saint, and to keep that going. And the fact that it's something that was practiced by a man like Tolkien. I mean, I don't think that's nothing either.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, so in our homes, we are radical Nicholists, you could say, and so we Santa Claus is Saint Nicholas, and it's important to note, by the way, in a lot of Eastern Christian countries, for instance, Greece, it's actually Saint Basil who brings the presents, not Saint Nicholas. So that's like a whole extra. That's like a whole extra layer to the thing where you could say like Saint Nicholas is Father Christmas, but also sometimes Father Christmas is Saint Basil. So there's like a whole that's like a whole extra layer to the conversation. But but in our home, I mean, we're Americans. We're also in the Russian tradition and in our church, and so in that the sort of like Slavic tradition, it is Saint Nicholas who brings the presents. So anyway, all that to say, in our home, it's Saint Nicholas that brings the presents, and my children know that Saint Nicholas is a real person, and we celebrate his feast day. We venerate his relics. We kiss his icon every Sunday when we go to church. We have an icon of him here in the home as well. So what the approach that I have taken is simply to say, well, because I'm a Christian and not a crazy person, I believe in Saint Nicholas. You'd have to be like, I mean, Saint Nicholas is outside the Mother of God, is the most revered saint on the planet. And so even in like these Eastern Christian countries where Saint Basil is the one that brings the presents, because kids open their presents on January the 1st, which is the feast of Saint Basil the Great. There's still like you couldn't imagine a bigger saint than Saint Nicholas. Like, I mean, as an intercessor, as especially protector of children, etc. Like, he's one of the biggest saints, probably the biggest saint in the Christian world. And so like you'd have to be a crazy person, to ignore all of that and not believe in Saint Nicholas. And so what I have done is just to teach my children about Saint Nicholas, and of course on on Tuesday this week, December the 6th, which is the feast of Saint Nicholas, that my children will leave their shoes out the night before, and when they wake up in the morning, Saint Nicholas will have brought them some goodies in their shoes. But then, of course, they know that St. Nicholas also brings presents on Christmas Day. So what I've done is just to teach my children about St. Nicholas, and then to allow them to be exposed to and absorb the pop culture lore that exists in our country today, and in stuff like Narnia and the Father Christmas letters and elsewhere, to absorb just the kind of general lore about Santa Claus. And I have just allowed them, as they've grown older, to work those things out kind of on their own. So they have like their own sort of mythical map for St. Nicholas, and then here's all the Santa Claus traditions and where does the stuff fit in. And because they're kids, they're not super concerned with, they're not trying to like build a rigid timeline for exactly when and how did all of this happen, and don't these stories contradict each other? Because they're poets, they're natural poets, right? They can hold tensions in their mind, and usually it's not a problem. And sometimes they'll ask a clarifying question, and I'll say, well, here's the life of Saint Nicholas that we read to you every year. Here are some legends that about him that sort of arose over time, et cetera, et cetera. And it's just, there's no problem. It's not an issue. So this is how we do it in my house. Other people do it other ways. But I've always been inherently suspicious of debunkers, right? People who want to go around and like, oh, well, I don't believe in Santa Claus, so I need to make darn sure that you don't either.
Yeah, the Christopher Hitchens of Christmas.
Right. Yeah, or the Neil deGrasse Tyson of Christmas, or like whatever, right? So that's one thing. And then the other thing to kind of say, to kind of follow up on what I said a moment ago, your whole argument of acting on behalf of Saint Nicholas is exactly correct. If you don't believe that you can do something on behalf of somebody else and it count, then you don't understand the gospel. Right? This is the whole basic premise of Christianity, is that Christ is able to, by assuming our nature, right? He allows us to participate in his life, and this is how we're saved. So the whole basic, and then the cosmos is laid out in a series of fractal patterns, and so this is true all the way down the line. When I act in various capacities as the head of my home, as a representative of my parish and of my bishop in certain circumstances. But but I also have a day job where I work for the federal government, and sometimes I act on behalf. Sometimes in my interactions with the industry and the outside world, I'm acting on behalf of the federal government, right? And so when I'm speaking, when I'm saying something, it's not just Richard saying it. That's the United States government saying that, right? So we all have this capacity to act vicariously. I mean, literally, that's what the word vicar means. We have this capacity to act, this ability to act vicariously on the behalf of various people, and of course, the bishop acts vicariously on the behalf of Christ. The priests act vicariously on behalf of the bishop, and so on, right? So this is it's the whole premise of our faith, is that you can act in this way. And so, sure, did St. Nicholas get you these presents? Absolutely. Was dad the material cause of getting these presents? Also, yes, right? It's not really a problem. And these things are, I'm gonna go as far as to say that this kind of activity, this is salvific. Right. It's not just a matter of do this fun thing for your kids. But when you enter into the spirit of St. Nicholas, which, by the way, should involve feeding the poor, giving to the poor, feeding the hungry, living a life of prayer, really, if we could really embody his life, and we look at his life and we see his deep generosity, his stalwart defense of the faith, and specifically of the incarnation. So it's appropriate that he's kind of the Christmas saint, right? His stalwart defense of the faith, his deep love for his flock, his care for his flock. When you as a parent embody those things for your children, you're making St. Nicholas present to them, and you're making Christ present to them, because this is what saints do. They make Christ present. And when you do that, it will also be salvific for you. It's not just a nice thing you do for your kids, but then you also, because you are participating in something holy, you're participating in this higher pattern, it also makes you more like Christ.
That's
And
right.
yeah, so
That's right. I know we're running out of time, and I've been really enjoying this conversation. So I haven't really said much, but um, I want to hear Reno's thoughts. But you said something, Richard, about the cosmos a minute ago,
yeah.
and it made me think about what was going on in the cosmos when Christ was born and how much that matters. It mattered so much that there were several wise men who traveled a long way because of what they saw happening. It was very significant. And I think that My background, I was Protestant my whole life. I asked Jesus into my heart when I was 2 years old and again when I was 7. And I followed him my whole life. But this idea of the cosmos and how much it ties to reality and to mystery, to our faith, and to all of our being, I think is a really important idea that I was never taught.
Yeah.
And why I think that it is a very part of why I do the work I do in classical education too is because I think that, and Reno, you and I have talked about this because we work together, how important it is to bring in all of the seven liberal arts, including astronomy, tied tied correctly to music and geometry, and how once we get that restored properly in the education of children, it's actually going to help us see the truth of God, right? So I just needed to bring that in. But if you guys have anything to say about the cosmos and what was going on in the sky, I don't know if we have time, but maybe a little ditty of some sort.
Um, so, man, there's the really beautiful, all I can think about right at this moment is this really beautiful moment in the Proto-Evangelium of James, which is this very important early Christian document. It's not a canonized scripture, but the church has based a lot of our understanding of what was happening, for instance, at the Nativity on this document. So it was really important in the early church and is still part of our tradition today. But there's this beautiful moment where Joseph is walking along, like he's going to get the midwife, right? Right at the birth of Christ. And the whole world stops. And it's this really beautiful kind of very, if we were trying to like ascribe a genre to this particular passage today, we'd probably put it in like magical realism or something like that, because it feels very realistic, like it's very detailed. I wish I had it just like pulled up here so I could read it, but it's this beautiful moment as Christ is born, that time stops. And we are told in the hymns of the church, for instance, and in the writings of early church fathers like Saint Irenaeus of Lyon, that the mystery of the incarnation was a hidden secret, even from the angels, right? Which includes, the heavenly host, this idea of the heavenly host to the ancient mind, and certainly in the scriptures. I mean, just literally in the scriptures, stars and planets are angels. You could say they're controlled by angels or they're piloted by angels, if that helps you. But I mean, literally in the scriptures, if you read the Old Testament, for instance, stars and planets are angels. And so when you have this idea of like the heavenly host acknowledging the birth of Christ, right? The way that's appears in these beautiful stories and documents from the earliest days of our faith is as it's the stars singing when Christ is born, right?
You know why my banner on my Facebook page?
Yeah.
Look at the banner I had painted. There's a reason
Yes, I know. I've
for
seen
my
it.
classical education banner is stars coming down as angels.
But but this goes back to the book of Job. In the book
Yeah.
of Job, when this ties us nicely all the way back around to the tree of life, right? Which opens with this quote from the book of Job, this ubi sunt. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth, when the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God sang for joy? Right? Well, the morning stars sang together, the sons of God. Stars and then sons of God is this Old Testament term for angels. So those are the same thing, right? It's the stars, it's the angels singing at the creation of the cosmos, right? And God is saying to Job, "Where were you?" But what we have happening in the Gospels is that this happens again, like the birth of Christ into the world is a recreating of the world, right? That the stars stop and the sons of God sing again, because now Christ the light has come into the world, and he's come to banish the darkness, and he's come to destroy death, and he's come to do all these things. And so, And so to me, I mean, this is the I mean, Tolkien said, "He does not see stars, who does not see them first." How's that go? We should read this as a end to our discussion, and then Reno can fill in the deficiencies of anything I've said. But what does he say? He says he sees no stars, who does not see them first, of living silver made, that sudden burst to flame like flowers beneath the ancient song, whose very echo, after music long has since pursued. There is no firmament, only a void, unless a jeweled tent, myth-woven and elf pattern, and no earth, unless the mother's womb, whence all have birth. And if you look at a traditional Eastern icon of the Nativity, you will see all of this. You will see the stars as angels bursting to song, and you'll see the earth, the cave, the cave of the manger, right, the cave of the Nativity, enclosed around Mary and the Christ child like a womb, right, as Christ's light is being born into the darkness and the stillness of that moment. Our whole understanding of the cosmos as Christians goes back, I believe, to Christmas, right? And if you can see the world in this way, then you can start studying astronomy safely. If you don't, you'll end up like Neil deGrasse Tyson, which is one of the worst things that I could imagine.
Reno, what are you thinking?
We can. I'm going to kind of finish by returning to Tolkien's work and his thoughts. And I mean, this conversation about the star itself, I mean, obviously is apropos for Tolkien, right? I mean, famously, the legendarium begins with his own enchantment from the Anglo-Saxon poem Christ One, which is a series of antiphons. There were antiphons used during Advent in the Anglo-Saxon church, right? And Hail Erendil, brightest of angels, is one of the antiphons, which Erendil is both a star and a person and a meaningful signifier of he who precedes the Messiah. And we can kind of see that becomes embodied in Tolkien's own legendarium with Erendil, the voyage of Erendil, who is the star that reminds us of the hope to come, that darkness doesn't have the final say. Tolkien, when the company arrives in Rivendell on October the 24th, they rest there. They have respite, leisure time in kind of a classical education sense, right? And a classical Western sense. They have leisure to restore their souls and to contemplate the richness of what it means to be a human being. And the company leaves on December the 25th, and they set off for Mordor. The ring is destroyed on March the 25th, which is the Feast of the Annunciation and the traditional date of the death of Christ. Okay. And so I think this kind of the letters to Father Christmas for Tolkien were paramount in understanding this complete story, right? That there is a relationship between what it means to be inheritors of the faith, to worship a God who becomes human, who dies, and who is resurrected, and Santa Claus and elves in the forest. So I think this is why these stories are important and that they're true.
Yeah.
And as classical educators, if we don't see them as true and necessary, we're just kind of playing dress up, I think. Mm-hmm. And we might be only playing dress up as human beings as well.
This was amazing. I am so excited and glad that I had you guys on today. We could talk for another hour, I'm sure. And at the end of this episode, I went back and as you guys were talking, I looked back at the banner I commissioned for the Facebook theme, and there's the man in the moon, and the stars coming down with musical instruments, and there's
Yeah.
even pine trees in the background. And I didn't even ask her to put pine trees in there, so it's really
Yeah. I
it's
mean,
it's encouraging that
this is really the way the world
yeah,
is.
it
Yeah.
is.
Yeah.
Right. Right. Well, I want to encourage our listeners to find your podcasts, Reno's Facebook page, Tolkien's House of Being, and we will put links in our show notes for all of the different titles and ways to connect with Reno and Richard. Have a Merry Christmas,
Thank
and
you.
may Father, Spirit of Christmas, visit you, visit your house.
Thanks
Merry
very much for
Christmas.
having us.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
I'm going to read J.R.R. Tolkien's favorite lines from the Old English O antiphons, known as the Advent lyrics, or Christ One, written by the poet Kinniewolf sometime before the 10th century. This is the O Oriens, addressed to the Day Star. E alla rendel engla beortas offer middenjärs monem sended on sos festa suna leoma tort offer tunglas frutida gewane of silfom the simle in lites. Hail Rendale, brightest of the angels, sent to mankind over Middle Earth, righteous sun's radiance, splendid above all stars.
Thank you so much for listening. We invite you to experience the art of teaching through interactive learning communities at our Patreon page. Visit patreon.com/classical education. Also, be sure to join the conversation on our Facebook community at facebook.com/groups/classical education. We are a listener-supported podcast, so your support makes this podcast possible. As the great artist and educator John Ruskin once wrote, "Well, my friends, the final result of the education I want you to give your children will be, in a few words, this. They will know what it is to see the sky. They will know what it is to breathe it. And they will know, best of all, what it is to behave under it, as in the presence of a Father who is in heaven."